All right, hello. Welcome everyone to this second part of the Next.js intro. If you don't know what Next.js is, or if you want like an introduction to what exactly Next.js is and how to set up a Next.js project, I suggest you go to part one of this series. In this second part, or in the first part, we discussed exactly what Next.js is, how it's different to something like Create React App, and what some of the built-in features of Next.js are. And we took a look specifically at the routing system and how Next serves up files to the client. In this second part, we're going to focus on this last point over here, which is Next.js's pre-rendering. So what Next.js does is it attempts to optimize the pre-rendering of a page. So essentially it tries to render as much as possible of the page into HTML on the server side before serving it to the client, okay? If the contents of the page are completely static, then Next.js will send the client everything in the HTML file. If there are any interactive components on the page, then what Next.js will do is that it'll send some minimal JavaScript. And as soon as that loads, the HTML will be hydrated and all your little interactive bits will become active. So if you have a component or a page with some internal state and some interactivity, then all of that stuff gets loaded as part of the JavaScript. But the actual content of the page, that gets generated, that gets pre-rendered in the backend. Now, when it comes to pages with data, and data specifically that's coming from an outside source, Next.js has several different strategies that you can use, and it all depends on your needs. So let's take a look at the starting point that I have right now. We've got an application here. There's a little landing page with a bootcamps button. And if you press on the bootcamps button, you get to this page, which is a list of bootcamps that we have here at Coded. And if you click on a bootcamp, you get taken into a detailed page with information about the different cohorts that we have, who the instructors are. Nothing too spectacular. And the way I have that set up right now is that I've got our list page here at bootcampsindex.js. And for those of you who remember from the last video, this renders to the URL /bootcamps. So this is this page right here. And I've also got a detail page, which is a dynamic route with an ID parameter. And this renders to bootcamp/ID. I've got a little bit of error checking to render a 404 if this bootcamp isn't found. But right now, all of my data is coming from this JSON file right here. So it's all static data that is in the server itself. And essentially what Next is going to do is it's going to pull that data into the component, and it's going to render it to HTML statically. And these pages, when they're served, are going to be completely static. It's going to be pure HTML. All right, so let's take a look at the different strategies. Let's start with the strategy that you might be used to, or you're probably used to if you've been working with React for a while. This is where your data is fetched on the client side, especially if you're dealing with single page applications. This is normally the format that you would follow. So client side rendering. Essentially what happens is that Next will build as much of the page as it feasibly can and turn it into HTML. And then it will load the JavaScript. And then that JavaScript is responsible for making the request using Ajax to fetch the data. And then the rest of the page will be populated with that data. So So examples of this, like you probably use this for a lot of the pages that you've been building. But like good reasons to use it with Next would be if you had a page where the data depends on some context in the front end, some context on the client side, some context in the browser itself. So the example that springs to mind is something that requires authorization. If you need to send a token with the request, you can only do that in the client. You can only send that information in the client. Sorry, I just realized that I didn't check if you had any questions at this point.
No, everything is clear at the moment.
Okay. So some examples of pages where you would need to use CSR. Let's say you have like a user-specific dashboard or a calendar, like a personal calendar, or maybe a cart in an e-commerce website. You can't render those things ahead of time. You can't know, without knowing who the user is, what the data is going to be. The backend response is going to be different depending on who the user is. So this has to happen. This has to happen on the client side. So to use CSR in Next.js, this is going to look very familiar because essentially what we're going to do is make AJAX requests in our components. So let's convert this, what we have right now, into CSR. Okay. So first of all, I'm gonna get rid of this because we're not going to be importing our data from here anymore. We're going to be fetching it from an API. By the way, just to clarify, I've got an API running on port 3001 that will give me data that's structured similar to that JSON file that we had, which is a list of bootcamp objects, which I can use in the front end. Okay, so let's make a request to that. So we want our bootcamp list. First of all, let me get some things from React. Use state and use effect. Oops. From React.
You have an extra F in effect.
Oops. Thanks, Khaled.
No.
Let's import Axios, which I'm not sure if I have installed, but let's find out. I do not, so let me just make sure I install that while we're waiting. Okay. And what we're going to do is that we're going to create a state for our bootcamps, set bootcamps. Okay. Use state, initially an empty array. Okay, and I'm going to create a fetch bootcamps function, fetch bootcamps, which is an async function. And what it's going to do is let's make our Axios request. Axios.get. And I'm going to make this request to that backend that I just showed you, which is localhost 3001/bootcamps. So this will get a list of bootcamps. And let's use set bootcamps and pass it the data. And this will set my state. The next thing we want to do is we want to have a use effect with no dependencies. So essentially it's running when this component mounts, and it's just going to call fetch bootcamps. Oops. Yeah, it's just going to call fetch bootcamps. So essentially what we're doing in this component here is that we're going to be requesting the bootcamps when this component loads, and they'll be fetched, and then this will be updated. Okay, so if we go to our front end now, and we go to the bootcamps list, you can see there's one more bootcamp which is coming from the backend. And if we check our network requests, when I refresh this page, there's the request right there. Okay, it's happening in the client side. Right? Every time I refresh the page, there's a bit of a lag where there's nothing there, and then this shows up. Okay, let me try and slow this down. Let's slow down to slow 3G. This might be too slow. I think this might be too slow. Switch it to fast 3G. Interesting. I don't know why this is taking such a long time. Okay, there we go. Weirdly enough, the part that took the longest time was loading up these files in the beginning. Anyway, there's like a moment where there's nothing on the page, where it's blank, and then this request is made, and then the data comes back. But if you notice this, the nav bar, the search bar, all that stuff is already there. It's already, the HTML is already there. This is just the part that takes time to render. Okay. So this shouldn't be unusual to anyone who's familiar with React. We're just making the request in the component. Maybe you'd make this request in like as part of a Redux flow. That's fine. It would still be CSR. Essentially, the client is making the request. And if we come to our detailed page, we can do something similar. I'm going to copy paste this just because I don't want to. I don't want to take too much time writing stuff which people are familiar with. So let's come over here. And some interesting things that we have to watch out for. It's going to be our responsibility because we're in CSR mode. We have to create a loading state to check if this bootcamp is missing, if it's null because it hasn't been fetched yet, or if it's null because nothing was found. I have this endpoint over here, which is say localhost 3001 bootcamps 1. This will return a single bootcamp. Bootcamps 11 doesn't exist. This should 404, but it's not doing it over here. Okay. Not sure why it's not working over here, but essentially that's what that endpoint will do. It'll throw a 404 error if it can't find a bootcamp. Some of the other things that are strange that we need to do. So this query that's coming from user router, when this page first loads, this query will be empty. Okay, then there will be an update when this ID is provided. Okay, and then we can fetch bootcamp. So my use effect actually has a dependency. It will run when the ID changes. Okay. We're responsible for handling this error state. We're responsible for checking if something is loading. So now if we come back here, let me just clear this and refresh this page. Here's a request for all bootcamps. Here's our request for this specific bootcamp. Okay. If I go back, there's another request for bootcamps. There's another request for number 2. So these requests happen every single time you switch pages as well. So Khaled, do you have any questions before we check the next part?
So, so for example, in React, usually fetching bootcamps would happen one time since it doesn't change a lot. So is there another method that we can use that it doesn't keep fetching bootcamps?
So
since
the reason
it's not something we always need to update.
Right. If this page was doing more, if this list page was doing more, then well, actually, let me think about this for a second. Essentially, no. So with Next.js is going to be caching a lot of these requests for you, by the way, in production. So the repeated requests are not that bad. But every time you land on a page in Next.js, that page is starting from scratch.
Yeah,
There's
because
no
it's
preserved.
treated as an individual React like
Exactly.
app.
So it's as if you're landing in a single page application for the first time. All your initial fetches are going to run all over again. And when you switch pages, that will happen. There is something you can do, I think, but I'm not sure if it works with CSR. Where's our, let's go to our link in our bootcamp card here. And I'm going to say prefetch. Okay. And let's go to our bootcamp detail. There's a, actually, let's go to our navbar. This is our link to go back to bootcamps. Let's say prefetch over here. I'm not sure if this will work in CSR. So what prefetch does is it pre-renders, it makes sure the HTML for whatever this link points to is already ready before you even click it. Okay. So let's see if that actually changes anything. Let's come over here. So no, you see it didn't make that request. Every time I come here, it still has to fetch. And every time I come back here, it still has to make that request for bootcamps because this is CSR. Because these requests are happening on the client side. I think maybe with SSR this would work, but let's find out. Okay. I'm gonna remove those things I added, just because I don't want to make it too confusing. Okay, let's go over here. All right. So that was CSR. Again, something that most React developers, all React developers should be very used to and very comfortable with. That's kind of the way we're used to doing things. But the second way that Next gives you to fetch data is something called server-side rendering. So in server-side rendering, the request doesn't happen in the browser. It doesn't happen on the client side. It happens in the server when a page is requested. So if I request /bootcamps, then the request to the backend to get the bootcamp list will be made on the server, and then it'll be injected into the HTML, and then that will be served. Okay, so the HTML gets fully generated in the backend, and then the user gets just HTML, and they don't have to make the request in their browser. But with SSR, you're still re-requesting the data every single time you land on the page. It's just that request isn't happening in the browser anymore. It's now happening in the server. So what are some scenarios where you'd use SSR? Well, it actually tells you should only use SSR in cases where, well, first of all, it's when the data needs to be up to date, in the same way that CSR data needs to be up to date. It's not dependent on any context in the front end, so it's not a dashboard or something that's user specific. But let's say like it's a public page with like, I don't know, currency exchange rates or like a list of videos in a platform where the videos get updated and changed regularly. That's where you'd use SSR. But the recommendation is that you should use SSR only in cases where you need to pre-render it. For example, for SEO, for public pages that require search engine optimization, you don't want a situation where Google comes to your page and sees nothing. So you would pre-render the data so that a web crawler, when it lands on a specific page, sees everything rendered from the start. Okay. The reason they recommend against this is because A, there's a better way to do it, which I'm going to show you in a minute. And B, because it actually takes a bit longer to serve the page because it has to be generated. There's more goes into generating the page in the backend. So the time to first load or the time to first byte, essentially the time between the user seeing a blank page and something showing up is a little bit longer. Do you have any questions about this before I jump into the code?
No, sounds clear.
Okay. So the way that you would tell Next.js that you want this page to be server-side rendered, okay, is by exporting a function from the page. You can only do this in a page, by the way. You can't do it in a regular component. You would export an async function called get server side props. Okay. And this function, why is this complaining? Oh, because I forgot to make this function. Okay. And this function is supposed to be returning some props that will be injected into this component during the render process, which is happening on the server. So we're going to return an, we're going to return an object. This object has to have a props key, and that props key is an object. And whatever we put in here will be injected into this component and will be considered a server-side prop. It'll be considered data for this page to render. Okay, so you can do anything here. You are on the server, so you're in a node environment. So if you wanted to, you could connect directly to a database. You could have a backend running on this Next.js server, and you could be pulling data into it from here. You can connect to files. You can read from the file system. You can do whatever you want in this function, because this function is not running in the user's browser. This function is running in the backend. It's running in the server. Okay, so what we're going to do is we're going to fetch our data, okay, over here. All right, and what I'm going to do is send a prop called bootcamps, which is our data. Okay, and this will end up right over here, which means we don't need the state, we don't need this, we don't need the effect. Essentially, our component just renders another component, which means that we could just return this component as the page if we wanted to. So let me get rid of all of these. Okay, and let's come to our front end and let's take a look. Oops. I think I may have, did I misspell something?
No, I think the error is it's trying to filter on something that is not defined yet.
Yeah, but I'm not sure why that's happening. Let's rerun the server. It might be that when you switch to SSR or anything other than CSR, you might need to rerun the server. Let's just take a look. Yeah, I guess that was it.
Yeah.
Okay, so you'll immediately notice that the request is missing from here. It's not here anymore. If you notice, if I refresh the page, there's no loading state. I don't have to worry about loading here because I wait until I have data over here. I do all my loading checks over here. So by the time this component is rendering, it's guaranteed to have data. Okay. And like I said, there's no AJAX request over here because this function is running in the server. So if I were to put a console log here, fetching data, okay. Hang on a second. Can't hide this. Okay, and let's rerun this page. Okay, there's fetching data. It's happening here in my node environment on the server. If I refresh this page, it's going to fetch the data again. Okay, let's go to our API. Okay, and I'm going to change coded live to coded life. So let me go to the backend that's running up here. You can't see this, but I'm just changing some stuff in the database. Okay, so if I refresh this page, you can see this change to coded life. instead of coded live. So now if I come back here and I refresh, that change actually takes effect. Okay. I mean, if you're coming from a React world, you're thinking like, what's the big deal? Of course it's going to take effect. But the next thing we're going to do, this doesn't actually happen. The next form of data fetching will not include this. But we'll see that in a minute. But is everything clear at this point?
Yes, but question, should we handle, for example, what if our backend is not working for any reason? Do we like give bootcamps a default value?
Right. So when it comes to error handling, you're going to do it however you normally do it, or whatever you would normally do. Like wrap this in a try catch, and then in the catch block, you do something so that you have data. I think I actually have that example for the detail page, because the detail page is has a bit more meat to it. I mean, this is pretty straightforward. Fetch list of bootcamps, render list of bootcamps. If this is empty, then don't show any bootcamps. But the detail page has a bit more. So I'm going to have a try catch in there actually. So
Okay.
let's come over here. What I'm going to do is I'm going to change this so that we're not dealing with all of this over here. Okay. We don't have a fetch bootcamp. Okay. We don't have the use effect. So my component is literally just, it's not even this. I don't even have a loading state anymore, because again, if I reach here, that means I'm done fetching data, because we're in SSR mode. The data fetch finishes before it even gets to the client. Okay. So let's get rid of this and this. We do need Axios because we're going to make a request. Let's export async function get server side props. Okay. And we're going to make the request here. But the question is, there was something I was using to fetch the bootcamp, right? Like when I'm making a request to bootcamp/1, I expect to get coded live. I need this ID, right? If I go here, I need this ID number 2. By the way, this is running because I haven't saved yet. And where were we getting that from before?
From the params and the slug field or
Exactly.
ID.
From the ID parameter, which was coming from use router.query, right? But
Yeah.
now we're over here. Now we're on the server side. We can't use a hook because this is not a React component. Okay. So instead, what you have is you have this context object, okay, that's being passed to get server side props. And this context object contains some things that you might need to know. It contains the context that this component is being rendered in. And one of the things that it has is the parameters. Now, this is kind of weird, the fact that it's called query over here, but over here on the server side, it's called params. I think because this is newer than the code that was happening up there. I'm not sure. But let's see. I can say const ID equals context dot params. So I can pull params, I can pull ID out of the params object. Okay. The next thing that I need to do is I can get my data.
Fetch. Yeah.
I can do my request over here to 3000 with the ID. Okay, and let's go over here and let's return props bootcamp. Okay, and bootcamp up here now becomes a prop.
Shouldn't bootcamp have the value data?
You're right. So what I was going to do is const bootcamp equals data, which I know seems redundant, but it'll make sense in a second. So if we come here now, this is running. Let me refresh this page. Let's go to full stack. I think this ran as SSR. Let me just check. Let me just make sure.
I think we said that if we put a server side render, we have to restart the.
I'm not sure if that's true, but let me check. There isn't a second request over here. And it was SSR, so it is working. I don't know why sometimes the hot reloading requires a restart. But this is working now. So this is running on the server. And something that you might notice, if you land on this page for the first time, actually, let's go back here. Let's go to data. You will get a little request, but it's a request for JSON. Okay, and this is the data that's being sent with the HTML file, and it'll be combined with the HTML file. It's not the equivalent of a full request. It's literally just a JSON file, which means it's a few bytes. It's not that big. Okay, so this is much cheaper than making a full request. If we go to bootcamps, I think if you refresh this, okay, this one doesn't have it for some reason. But the other thing you'll notice is that it gets cached. No, it doesn't get cached.
Can you go to the like the root URL and then go to bootcamps?
The root URL and then go to bootcamps. Yeah, there we go. There's the bootcamps.json. Okay. I think when you navigate to a page, it gets sent from the backend to hydrate the page. I'm not sure. I don't want to say anything that might be misleading about this. But now what's happening is that our this data is being fetched from the backend, but we have an issue right now, which is I can easily go to bootcamps 11. Actually, at 404, which is interesting. Shouldn't have given me a 404.
You have a condition that if there is no bootcamp, then return error 404.
Right, but this should have
line
crashed.
8.
This should have crashed. So let me just double check what's happening here. I think I may have removed the 404. So it's not crashing anymore. And so that's interesting. Let me make some changes to the backend so that this throws an error, because that's what you would normally get from the backend. Just give me 1 second. Let me just see if I fixed the way the backend is behaving. It's not behaving the way I expect it to. If I go to 11, so there we go. I got a 404 right over here. So this is what we actually expect. If we make a request to a resource that exists, we get it back. If we make a request to the resource that doesn't exist, we get a 404. Okay, so that should change the way this behaves. But if you see now, this is what happens when we try to access a page that doesn't exist. We get a very ugly next error right here, which isn't as nice as the 404 we were getting before. So what we need to do is what you were suggesting, Khalid, which is we need to actually wrap this in a try-catch. We need to we are responsible for handling the situation where this didn't work. So let's do that here, try-catch. If there's an error, I'm just gonna console.error, error.message. Otherwise, take this up here and let's create a let's bootcamp and just remove the const from this. And this should handle that situation. It'll send an error and then it'll send an undefined bootcamp, and then this will render our 404 page. So if we come here, interesting.
I think initially bootcamp should be null, maybe, because undefined cannot be serialized as.
Give me 1 second. I want to make sure that this is throwing an error. I want to check if our, yeah, request failed was status code 404. Let me just check this again. This went a lot more smoothly this morning. Undefined, which is fine. What is it complaining about? Serializing .bootcamp returned from get server side props. Okay. I didn't get this error this morning, but let's do that. Let's set this to null to begin with. It can't be undefined, just like you said, Khalid. So this should work now. Okay, yeah. So now we get a 404. If I go to a bootcamp that exists, I get the page. If I go to a bootcamp that doesn't exist, I get a 404. Okay. We got a little bit sidetracked over here, but is it clear what's happening?
Yes.
Okay. The core of it is that this data fetch happens, instead of happening in the browser, it's happening on the server. This is also very useful, by the way, if in situations where you can't guarantee the quality of the stability of the internet connection on the client side, because this is going to be run using the server's internet connection. This request is going to come from the server that's serving up this Next.js. Okay. Anyway,
okay,
enough
just
about
a question.
SSR.
Is it good practice to always have a default value for the variable? For example, bootcamp as null, bootcamps as an empty array. So just in case anything goes wrong from the backend, then at least you have the initial value as null, and the rest of the code would behave normally. The front end wouldn't crash.
Yeah, that's probably a very good idea. I mean, over here we can do it. We can do it like this, but I mean, you'd still need to try catch, so maybe it might as well do it in the get server side props.
Okay.
But yeah. All right, so that was SSR. Now, Next.js's superpower is called static site generation. So this is the third way that you can fetch data. Now, if you can find as many situations as possible where you can use SSG, then that's amazing. Because the way SSG works is that this request gets made at build time. Okay, it doesn't get made when there's a request. So it's not being made on the client side, it's still being made in the server, just like SSR. But instead of this request happening every single time we try to request this page, it actually happens just once, just one time when you deploy the website. So essentially the website it renders the entire page into pure HTML and maybe like a small JSON file for the data, and then sends that to every single user. So for example, Khalid, if you made this request, if you made a request for this page, or let's say this page 100 times, this request to the backend will still only happen that the first time the website was run. It wasn't even you that triggered it. It was just deploying the website that triggered it. This saves a huge amount of resources if you can do it. Like I said, the page will be fully rendered on the server. The data will not be re-requested, even if the client refreshes the page. The data of the content will remain static to when the page was initially built. So this is the downside. This is the trade-off here. If you use SSG, if you use pure SSG, there's more stuff which I'm going to mention, but we're not really going to get into. If you use pure SSG, then whatever state your data was in when the site was deployed, it'll be frozen in that state. It won't refetch the data. Okay. So what does this mean? When should you use SSG? You should use it in cases where the data is public. It's not context dependent, so it doesn't need authorization or anything. The data should be stable or slow moving, as in it's not gonna change, or if it changes, it's not a big deal to redeploy the website, or to wait until a website redeploy. So examples of this, let's say you have a personal blog, unless you're a news website where you're essentially updating your articles within minutes of each other. If you're running a personal blog, then you're probably posting at most once a day. And in which case you can set some stuff up where it's like, if I post this, then redeploy the server. It's fine. Let's say you're an e-commerce platform and somewhere you have a list of your locations. You're not going to be opening a new shop every day. So that can be statically generated. Let's say at Coded, we don't add a new bootcamp every day. We might add cohorts, which wouldn't be statically generated, but we don't add a new bootcamp every single day. And even the cohorts, we don't actually add, like we run what, 4 cohorts a year? Maybe we're getting like close to 5 or 6 at this point, but it's not that frequent. So it's not a big deal if we add a new cohort and then redeploy our website, which is what we do with our Join Coded website, by the way. So these are examples of things where SSG would be very useful. Now, there is something I'm going to mention, which is new to Next.js, very new to Next.js, and it's called incremental regeneration. And it kind of means that you can use SSG everywhere, and it kind of makes SSR, the way we just did it, a little bit redundant. But what it does is that you can set 2 things. You can set a timer on the page that's being generated, that has been generated, and it will refetch the data on the client side when they're running this page. And the other thing that you can do is that if the data has changed, you can trigger it so that it uses SSR, and then it kind of builds an SSG version in the server. Anyway, it gets a little bit complicated. So let's just focus on pure SSG. So the examples that I just gave, which is like blog posts, shop locations, courses, yeah, let's do that. So Khaled, do you have any questions about SSG? I feel like I kind of went on a bit of a tangent.
No, it's fine. But I was wondering about one example in my head, and I was wondering whether we should use SSR or SSG. So let's assume we're creating a website and there is an about page. The content is dynamic. It's based on the backend, but it doesn't really get updated frequently. The about page could be updated maybe once or twice a year. So I guess the best type of request that should be made is SSG in that condition.
Absolutely, that's a perfect example of SSG. The data is changing very, very infrequently. So it's a waste of resources that every time a user requests this page, your backend gets a hit and another request gets made to fetch exactly the same data that won't change except once or twice a year. That's a perfect example of SSG. Okay. All right, so let's take a look at how this is done. So in our in our list page, this is actually pretty straightforward. To tell Next.js to use SSG, we're just going to change it from get server-side props to get static props. Okay, everything else stays exactly the same on this page. Okay, it gets a bit more complicated with dynamic pages, but everything else stays exactly the same. And yeah, so let's do that. Now, there's something you need to know. If you're using yarn dev for the hot reloading feature, okay, all SSG pages will be treated as SSR, which means they will re-request and rebuild every time you make a request. Okay, and that's just to save your sanity when you're in development mode, because you're probably going to be changing the data quite a bit and you want it to reflect. Okay, but yeah, this page now is using SSG. So if we refresh this, okay, you kind of don't even really see a lag. It's basically shows up immediately. And there's no request over here. But right now, if I put a console log over here, SSG, okay, when I make this request, it's still happening on request. Okay, so to be able to appreciate what SSG actually does, let's come here, and instead of yarn dev, we're going to yarn build and yarn start. Okay, and this will create a production ready build, and then it'll serve it on port 3000. So let's wait for it to actually build. And I'll show you a few interesting things. When you run yarn build, it tells you which pages were created using SSG and which pages were created using SSR. Okay, and this static thing, by the way, is pages that don't use any either. So Next is static by default. So let's take a look. Our bootcamp's ID, because the last experiment we were running was to use SSR, that's rendered as an SSR page. Okay, bootcamps is rendered using SSG. It's pre-rendered using SSG. And if you notice, somewhere up here, where's my console log? Where's my console log? That's interesting.
You didn't refresh the page yet. Maybe that's why.
Oh, it's right here. Sorry.
Okay.
It's weird that it's kind of bundled into this. They're not expecting you to console log in here, but this is where it happened. The site wasn't even deployed yet. Okay, it's just generating static pages, and that's when this request was made. And if I come here now, nothing, no requests, absolutely nothing. If I come back here, no requests, nothing. This page is already generated. The HTML is ready. The only thing the user needs to get is the HTML file. And I think it also comes with like a little JSON file similar to the one that I showed you earlier, just to fill in this content. But that happens so fast that it's not even seen. I think if I come here, I go back here, there's the JSON file, but it's blindingly fast. The user doesn't have to wait for anything. All they have to wait for is getting the HTML file. That's it. Okay. Is it clear how this is different from SSR?
Yes, that's clear.
Okay. All right. So now, here's where things get a little bit complicated. Okay. Here we have a dynamic page. Okay. And SSG has access to the context, but it also needs to know, because these pages are going to be pre-built. Okay, literally they're going to be pre-built. It needs to know what pages are going to exist, what pages need to exist. Again, like I said, SSG is for very slow moving, very static data. Okay, so in addition to exporting get static props, okay, get static props, we also need to know what the pages are going to be. So there's another function we need to export, which is export default, or sorry, this is an async function. Async function get static paths. Okay. And this function is supposed to return a list of all the parameters of these pages. So all, in this case, all the IDs. If this page was slug, then it would need to return a list of all the slugs. If this page was, if this was in a folder which was slug and then it had an ID, then it would need to return all possible combinations of slug and ID. Okay, it's exhaustive and it's a bit expensive, but remember this request only has to happen once during deployment. And the format that it expects to return is something like this. So we need an array. And in this array, we have objects. These objects will have params, and each params object will have values for all the parameters. So in our case, we only have one parameter, which is ID. So for example, if I did this, okay, if I said get static paths, return params with an ID of 1, what's going to happen when I rebuild this site, okay, just give it a few minutes or a few seconds. Oh, I got an error. Oh, I forgot something. This is actually not, it shouldn't return an array, it should return an object with paths. And it also has a second property called fallback, which we're going to set to false. This fallback thing has to do with what I was talking about earlier with incremental regeneration, but we're not going to get into that today. But essentially what we're saying here, when we send this array of paths, is we're saying there's only one page for this ID, for this dynamic URL, and that page has ID 1. So now when I rebuild again, give it a second. We got another error. Oh, these have to be strings. I actually didn't know that. Third time is the charm. Okay, so there you go, it was generated. You can see now both of these pages are statically generated. And also, we specifically have a bootcamps 1 page. Okay, so now if I come here and I go to bootcamps 1, it's there. If I come back here and I go to bootcamps 2, that's embarrassing. Give me a second. Should not have generated it.
I think it made the request for bootcamps too.
Just give me a second. Let me. This is weird. Did you say it made a request for bootcamps too?
Yeah, I think, but it did it on the server side, not the static.
This is weird. It should not have. It shouldn't have worked. Let me go to bootcamps 404. Just give me a second. I'm not sure what's happening here. This shouldn't have worked. Unless unless incremental regeneration is now by default, just in the last couple of days. Let me check something quickly. Let's go to coded life, and I'm going to change this back to live and just see what happens. Nothing should happen. If I refresh this, yeah, this is still live. Let's change the name of a cohort. Let me try this again. Okay, this is statically generated. Let's go to full stack. And let's change summer 20 to summer 2021. This is very interesting. I'm not sure how this is happening. Let me try to, wonder if there's a way to disable the cache. There we go.
Can you check the backend if you're getting a request for 2 every time you refresh?
My backend is extremely basic. It's basically a little tiny Express app, so it's not logging anything.
Okay.
It's not capturing any requests, but I guess I could check here. Console.log request for rec.params.id. Okay, this is running. Nope. Well, this is bootcamps 1. This isn't making a request either. This is very interesting.
Let's assume it's smart enough to generate the rest of the IDs.
Okay. So I'm
assuming what you wanted to do was fetch all bootcamps in this get static paths and then loop over the bootcamps to generate the paths and IDs.
Yeah, let me check this build actually, because maybe it's in here somewhere. Cache. Let me remove this build folder and let me check if that changes anything. But yeah, see, there's like a 1.html, but that's the only HTML file. There's also an id.js, so maybe it's using this to make that request. Interesting.
Try now.
Okay, there we go. It was being cached. Nope, still works. Not sure how it works. This is really fascinating.
What if you put a console log in the get static props and see if it gets called by any chance? I'm assuming not, but
yeah, it should not be able to fetch this data. Not what? You want me to console log the bootcamp?
No, it's all right.
Yeah. Let's see. This should only run once. Yeah, there's the bootcamp. This is the only one that was fetched. So how is it even getting that data? Do you think this is Chrome messing with us?
Okay, maybe.
Full stack. Oh no, there's a request. It got made.
Yeah, I guess that if the path is not previously defined, then the get static props acts like SSR.
That's interesting. That what that means is that the incremental generation that I was talking about before is now happening by default. Even when I set this fallback to false. That's really weird. What this fallback false should do is that it should make this not happen. But essentially what's happening now is that it will, for any pages that were missing when this function was run, it will generate them later. It will attempt to fetch them and then it'll generate them later. Which is great, to be honest. Okay, but let me just show you what you would actually do here. So const data equals, let's say, await. I have an endpoint, which is 3001 bootcamps IDs, and this gives you the IDs of all bootcamps in the backend. So axios.get http localhost 3001. Just give me a second, I want to try something. I'm looking at my server logs, by the way, and this request, the request for each of these was only made once. So it's just like you and I were saying right now, which is that the SSG,
it acts like an SSR.
Yeah, but only once. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, even on the left, the HTMLs were generated for 2 and 3. If you notice.
There we go. That's amazing. Yeah. But I didn't set that, so I don't understand how this is actually happening. Okay.
Yeah.
Unless there's been an update to Next and now it's by default. Just give me a second. Let's go through the docs. Let's go to data fetching. Get static props. Maybe I'll mention it then if that's the case.
Yeah, maybe if the documentation makes it clear, we could attach it to the description of the video.
Just give me a second, I'm just looking this up quickly. Get static paths for the fallback section. If fallback is false, then any paths not returned by static paths will result in a 404. You're seeing this, right? This says false, right?
Yeah.
I'm not sure why it's.
I'm reading a blog and it says that the new fetching methods get static props and get server side props. There's also a get static paths introduced to generate static pages for dynamic routes. Here is how it works, but they didn't bring anything regarding. Okay, notice that fallback key being passed. If the value of fallback is false, then any path not returned in the get static arrays will result in a 404 page error.
Yeah, so this should throw a 404 for any pages that aren't listed here. So I'm not sure why.
I guess fallback knows we're recording and then now it's deciding to activate.
I guess. Okay. All right. Well, what I was gonna do is I'm gonna take this data that's coming from here, which is an array of IDs, and I'm gonna convert it to paths to this format. So data.map ID will return an object
params,
which is params ID. Okay, and instead of this, we'll just have this. And let's try that now. Let's see if that works. Yarn build and yarn start. Let's see if this gets rebuilt and removes these old pages. It's keeping these pages. Well, yeah, it's keeping these pages because now there's one for each of them.
yeah.
But let's try. So there's that. This is the first one, second one, third one. Okay. That's all statically generated. What if let's go to the backend, and I'm going to change it so that it only returns the IDs for 2 pages. I want to figure this out. So you get bootcamp IDs. I'm gonna just remove one. Or I'm gonna return just one ID. Okay, so here, I still want it to be an array. Here, we're just going to return an array with one ID. Okay, let's try that. So this should generate just a single HTML file, and it should 404 if it doesn't find it. Okay.
But it did not delete the HTMLs.
Interesting. Let me delete this. Okay, there's our one page. We open this, we should find just that one page. And if I come here, I shouldn't be able to find any other pages, right? Right?
You shouldn't.
If I go to bootcamps 2, I get a 404.
Okay.
That's what's expected, right?
Yeah.
If I go to bootcamps 3, get a 404. I think I might know what's happening. I think if I navigate to it from here, then the incremental site regeneration works. Yes.
Okay.
It assumes you're not going to add a link to something that doesn't exist, so it will try to fetch it.
Okay.
Which I actually didn't know that it did that. Yeah. Yeah,
but makes sense.
All right. So now if I go to 2 directly, oh, now this worked.
But now it built a basically it built the HTML for 2 and 3 because you visited them through a redirect.
Right. This is really weird. Okay. I guess it's even smarter than I thought, but anyway, the main idea here is that this data gets fetched at build time, and apparently it also gets fetched even if fallback is false. So these pages get built on demand.
Okay, can you go to bootcamp detail? The
right
component.
Here? This is where I am. Yeah.
No, like the returned component.
This one?
I was wondering if I'd find an access request here, but
no, that would make more sense than what's happening. Okay. All right, so what's the issue here is that if I go to my data and I change, let's change coded live to coded life. Okay, so if I come back here and I make a request for bootcamp/1, there's coded life, okay, instead of coded live.
Okay.
But if I come here and I go to bootcamps, it still says live, okay?
Yeah, because it
and
was generated already.
It will always say live. If I want this update to reflect, I would have to rebuild and redeploy. The other ways that that becomes problematic, let me change something in the backend again. So if I now make a request to bootcamps, this is bootcamp 11. Okay, this is not, the ID is changed to 11. But if I come here, it's still at 1. Okay, but of course, now if I go to 11, apparently it's just going to generate. Okay, that didn't work. This time.
Yeah, because the list of IDs, the list of IDs change. You need to rebuild for it to make a new request to bootcamp/ID and then returns the new ID and generates a new page.
It's there now. Well, no, that's 1. Never mind. Bootcamps 11. No. Okay.
Unless you have a link that would take you to bootcamp 11.
That worked somehow. So I think maybe like you said, if these links, did I leave the prefetch on?
No, you removed it.
Did I leave the prefetch? Are you sure?
Type prefetch in the search.
No, I must have removed it. But yeah, that's the basic concept behind SSG. And like I said, with new Next.js, and when I say new, by the way, if I go to the documentation right now, let me just search for incremental static regeneration. That's been the case since Next 9.5, and the version of Next that we're using is 9.5.2. So this is very, very new. But essentially, what you can do at this point is that you can make sure the data is up to date. So I'm actually gonna do it now, just because I don't think it would be that big of a problem. Khalid, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, sorry, because your voice was cutting out. In addition to returning these props, okay, I'm also going to return a revalidate, and I'm going to set it to 1. Okay.
Okay. What does this do?
So now if we come here and I refresh this page, I need to rebuild, sorry. You're on build and you're on start. Okay, let's refresh this. This says coded life. Okay, and let me try changing this to coded live with ID 1. So now this is coded live with ID 1 again. And let me refresh this.
But you put the revalidate on bootcamp, not bootcamps.
Right.
On the detail.
Yeah. Let me put it here. Revalidate 1. And let's rebuild again. Still rebuilding. Okay, let's refresh. Coded live.
Change it back to live.
Yeah, let me change it back to ID 11 and coded life. Okay, there it is. If we come here, if I refresh this, there we go.
Yeah,
it's up to date. So this Well, now 11 is missing.
But
because I think
yeah,
you'd need to use this with, this is where the fallback comes into play. We can say fallback is true.
but you need to rebuild.
But I need to rebuild. You can see this SSG now happens incrementally in the backend.
Yeah.
Okay. So let's come over here, rebuild. This says life. Did I change it back to life? I did change it back to life. There's bootcamps 11. Bootcamps 2. This should also be, sorry, I'm checking the server logs. Let me change the data again. The ID is now 111, and this is life with a lot of Fs.
Refresh.
There it is.
Okay.
And 111 takes me here.
Yeah, it revalidated both the detail and the list view.
Right. So I think it's clever enough that it checks for changes, but essentially what this revalidate one says is every 1 second, check for an update. So it kind of polls the server. I'm still not completely sold on this, but it is interesting, and I think it's going to become I think it's going to be the new way to use Next.js.
Yeah.
Anyway, this has gone on for a very long time. So I don't know if you have any questions about SSG, SSR, CSR, where to use them, when to use them.
Okay, so I guess CSR is something that is user related, whether it's cart, profile, dashboard, or anything that is depending on user interaction from the front end side.
Yes.
SSR is
like I said,
I
SSR has
guess
it's kind of lost its place a little bit because now
yeah, but
SSG
I
has
can
this
say
incremental regeneration.
yeah, but I think what I can say is that maybe SSR can be used for things that are provided by the website owner, and they don't depend on users' interactions. So maybe if it's in an e-commerce, maybe an SSR could be the categories and subcategories of the products they're selling, but not the products themselves, since for example, the product stocks gets updated whenever a user refreshes the page. Not refreshes, I mean like visits the product detail.
Right, but like I said, with the revalidation, you can do that with SSG
redundant
as well.
Yeah.
I mean, it still has its place, but it's kind of being used under the hood. It's being used as part of this fallback. But SSR, in the way that we looked at it, that's kind of it's kind of become a little bit redundant.
Okay, but is revalidating expensive? Like checking every 1 second, is it like hitting the backend every 1 second, or how is it checking?
By the way, I think this is happening on the server side, but I'm not entirely sure how revalidation works. I'm pretty sure it's not as expensive as it seems, because if it is literally hitting the backend every 1 second, then that would be ridiculous. But yeah, I'm not really sure how it works exactly. I wasn't planning to show it today, but the fact that this fallback thing was happening anyway, it kind of made me think that I should show it.
Yeah. I guess revalidate, like the better use of revalidate could be, for example, that I know that every 1 month I need to update the website, so maybe I'd put a month buffer or something. But something such as a a minute, an hour. Could be ridiculous to rebuild or recheck with the backend.
Yeah. I'm not really sure. I mean, in their
Yeah.
own example, they've used 1 second as the revalidation time
Okay.
frame. So again, I'm really not sure how they're doing it. They've mentioned that like it'll never make multiple requests at the same time. So again, not really sure. So it's saying like Next.js will attempt to regenerate the page when a request comes in at most once every second. Doesn't seem,
Okay.
again, it doesn't seem efficient, but I don't really know
Yeah.
how it's working under the hood. Yeah.
Okay.
All right.
That was a very interesting talk. Thank you, Aziz.
Anytime. And thank you, Khalid. Thank you for keeping me company while I struggle to figure out why this wasn't working.
Okay.
All right. Okay.
Okay.
I'll see you next time. I think the next talk is going to be Material UI.
Yeah.
By you. Yeah.
Inshallah. Yeah, I will do.
All right.
Okay.
All right, Khalid. Yeah. Bye.